me!
What a great show! These Foundation events are usually stale.
Yo, Jungle Jim! Up here!
Welcome, true believers, to Spider Blood, a YouTube retrospective of the classic 1994 Spider-Man the Animated Series. I am the generally beautiful and moronic hack, and for the 7th entry in this retrospective, I will be covering the debut of one of Spider-Man's most unique villains. He is an original creation of Steve Ditko, starred in debatably Spider-Man's best storyline, and just recently had his own major motion picture. I am of course talking about Russia's greatest hunter, Kraven. Our story begins not in the beginning, but right in the middle of the action. What was supposed to be an opportunity of a lifetime for Peter Parker's scientific career quickly turned into a domestic dispute. His interviewer, Dr. Mariah Crawford, is being attacked by an estranged wild man in animal fur. The wild man blocks the doorways of the lab, preventing Peter from intervening, and Dr. Crawford makes a desperate break to the rooftop through the fire escape. Unfortunately, with nowhere else to go, she is trapped with the savage-looking pursuer. Not watching her footing, Mariah falls off the roof into the city streets below. That is, until Spider-Man swoops in and rescues the poor doctor. After trading a few blows with the wild man, Spidey manages to knock him off the rooftop. However, the man disappears from sight, and Spider-Man takes this moment of reprieve to take Dr. Crawford far away from the savage. Who was that wild man, and why was he so adamant in capturing Dr. Crawford? Unbeknownst to our wall crawler, the city of New York has now become a concrete jungle for Kraven the Hunter. Season 1, Episode 7, Kraven the Hunter is a unique Villain of the Week episode compared to what we have previously seen in the season. Right off the bat, the episode starts in the middle of the story, which is a first for the show. In doing so, the story gives us a classic conflict of a maiden being attacked by a monster or monster-like villain, and throughout the episode expand on their story. Spider-Man himself, despite being the hero and protagonist, almost feels like a secondary character in this episode. Kraven and Mariah Crawford's relationship takes center stage and is the driving force of the plot. Much like the Lizard, Dr. Octopus, and the Scorpion episodes, the writers give Kraven an empathetic backstory. In their telling of Kraven's origins, it was because of Dr. Crawford that Sergei Kravenov became a wild madman.
He was seriously injured. There seemed to be no hope, nothing I could do to save my love. As I watched his condition deteriorate, I made a decision, one that still haunts me. Sergei's recovery was immediate. It was a miracle. But my greatest fear came true. He changed so much that he took a new name for himself. Kraven the Hunter.
Examining this backstory, Kraven and Mariah's conflict combines all sorts of classic literary influences. Mariah's guilt of turning the noble Sergei into the savage Kraven is similar to how Dr. Frankenstein became horrified by the creature he created. Kraven's obsession and possessive nature to keep Mariah for himself, perverting the love they once shared, is a common cliche within werewolf and vampire fiction. And Mariah's end goal is to cure and restore the noble Sergei, the man she really loves and respects, much like how Belle's love for the Beast restored him to his true self. These are not one-to-one examples, but the episode utilizes all these different story tropes to create an original tale for Kraven. And in the middle of all of this melodramatic and sci-fi themed romance thriller is good old Peter Parker trying to understand what's going on and questions what mess did he get himself into. However, though the plot is focused on Mariah and Kraven, Peter is still an active character in their story. Without his contributions, our heroine, Mariah, could not have succeeded in curing Kraven. We also still get classic Spider-Man tropes, first with Robbie Robertson. He has made small appearances up to this point, but this episode is the first in which he is a supporting character in the story. Unfortunately, it is not much. Robbie is out of town, and without thinking it through, Spider-Man leaves Dr. Crawford at his unattended apartment. Despite her warnings that Kraven will find her, Spidey falsely believes that she is safe. As a result, Kraven does eventually find Robbie's apartment. But before his arrival, Mariah was able to sneak out when Robbie came home earlier than planned. Kraven bursts through the front door and kidnaps poor Robbie, believing that he is Mariah's secret lover. Now Spidey has to save his innocent friend and colleague, all thanks to his own unwise decisions. The other Spidey trope is that we get a brief scene where Peter gets a rare opportunity in which both Felicia Hardy and Mary Jane Watson want to be with him during a fashion show. But the old Parker luck strikes again as Peter has to disappoint both women in bailing on the fashion show to stop Kraven. A new record. Let's put our critical thinking caps on and examine this story. When it comes to the elements that matter, like an engaging plot, fulfilling character arcs, and interesting dialogue, the episode is on point. There is a lot of information that the story needs to share to the audience, and the showrunners did a good job of introducing Mariah and Kraven without ruining the fast pacing that the show is well known for. It was a good call to begin the episode with an exciting incident, so that young viewers will be hooked from the first scene and want to follow the rest of the story. That being said, the second half of the episode does have writing flaws that blemish this creative narrative. First, there is a plot contrivance in which Dr. Crawford was only able to finish her cure because she knew a colleague who was only mentioned once, never shown on screen, and who happened to have an available laboratory at night. Not the worst offense in writing, but because the episode takes place within one evening, the writers had to be practical in getting characters from one story beat to the next. But who knows, maybe it's normal for scientists to let other scientists use their laboratory at night under short notice. The second flaw in this narrative is how the showrunners lampshade Peter's solution to fighting Kraven.
No, I'm doing this all wrong. I'm letting Kraven call the shots. Maybe I should be looking for him instead. That's it. I must hunt the hunter. But where?
Kraven is who I am. I belong among the animals.
Of course! The African jungle exhibit. Oh, this is almost too obvious.
For context, the term lampshade is a writing trick in which characters of a story bring to attention an implausible event in the narrative. This is done so that the writer would call attention to a flaw or trope in their story in order to diffuse criticism. A famous example I know is this scene from The Emperor's New Groove.
It can't be. How did you get back here before us?
How did we, Kronk?
Well, you got me. By all accounts, it doesn't make sense.
Now, lampshading can be a valid literary device to use in your writing. The example I show works because it is used as a punchline for a joke, and because the film is a comedy, the audience can laugh at the absurdity of the moment. Unfortunately for Spider-Man, the lampshading in this episode comes off as flagrant and a quick fix to get Spidey into the climax of the episode. It is quite astonishing the showrunners would even consider lampshading a major plot point. Which leads me to speculate that the showrunners did not have the time and money to properly create a solution for Spidey to solve. And in the world of children's television, especially in the 90s, every frame and penny counts. This leads to our third major flaw of the episode, and it's a very simple one. How did Mariah know to head to the zoo to find Kraven? Spider-Man at least had a logical reasoning of where Kraven could be, even if it's not written well. And there was no line or background info to even have the audience infer that Mariah knew where to find Kraven. At best, you could argue she made the same logical assumption as Spider-Man, which again is still bad writing. This is the definition of a plot hole, and I hope you realize that these three issues all center around the climax. To reiterate, the first half of the episode did an admirable job in hooking the viewer into the story and showcasing Kraven's backstory without it being a hindrance. But the story starts to show cracks when it has to start getting the characters into the finale of the episode. In my opinion, the showrunners tried to do too much for Kraven's debut. You have the conflict between Mariah and Kraven, their backstory, and all while also bringing Spider-Man's own cast of characters to use and merging those storylines together into a big finale. Imagine trying to do that in under 22 minutes. This episode most likely stretched the abilities of the writers that they did have to resort to quick fixes for the final script. Yet, in spite of these criticisms, the episode still manages to be entertaining. As a whole story, its strength overshadowed its weaknesses. I enjoyed seeing Peter trying to balance everything going on with his superhero and personal lives. Both fights with Kraven were solid, and I do like the inclusion of the zoo as a set piece for the climactic final battle. It reminds me of something you would see in a Tarzan story, which is most likely deliberate. Mariah and Sergei's romance is an original concept for Kraven in this adaptation, and the episode would not be as entertaining to watch if I didn't believe those two were madly in love with each other, which made for great melodramatic moments. Lastly, I want to share a few odd moments that I noticed while watching the episode. It's time for my favorite part of Spider-Blood, where we compare the episode to the original comic series. Kraven the Hunter's comic debut was in Amazing Spider-Man number 15, which was released in Spidey's second year of publication. The original comic was written by Stan Lee and illustrated by Steve Ditko. Sadly, unlike the Mysterio and Scorpion episodes, the Kraven episode diverts entirely from the original comic. But they share a few peculiar similarities that I will talk about soon. First off, in the comic, Kraven has no detailed backstory. The most you get is that he is a famous wild game hunter from Russia. He arrives in New York City to purposely hunt down Spider-Man. But that's not the full story. You see, Kraven is not hunting Spider-Man just for the thrill of it. He was requested to hunt on behalf of Spider-Man's oldest nemesis, the cunning and conniving Chameleon. Since Chameleon would not be adapted until much later in the series, the showrunners decided to go a different route for Kraven's first episode. Though I would argue it was a missed opportunity to not do a faithful adaptation of the comic, which would still work even without Chameleon's inclusion. A majority of the story in the comic is showcasing how much of a threat Kraven is to Spidey, not just with his strength, but with his expert hunting skills and tactics. Lee and Ditko do a fantastic job building up the fight between Spidey and Kraven. The final fight is genuinely one of the best superhero fights I read from this era. You have Spider-Man having to use his wits and skills to outthink and outmaneuver Kraven, and by the end, Spidey turns the tide of the fight to his favor in a most satisfying victory. It would have been amazing to see this fight animated, but instead of a highly choreographed fight in a dimly lit park, we get a straightforward showdown in a zoo, which isn't bad at all, just not as exciting. This highlights the main difference between the comic issue and the episode. The comic puts more focus on the action and Peter's desire to prove himself against Kraven, while the show focuses on Kraven and his tragic romance. Spider-Man and the action scenes still play an important role in the story, it's just Kraven's story, not Peter's. However, there are a few story elements that the adaptation did keep from the comic book. Both versions of Kraven use some type of enhanced serum in order to match up with Spider-Man. In the show, it was an experimental serum that Dr. Crawford needed to inject into Sergei in order to keep him alive after he protected her from an animal attack. That serum is what caused Sergei to transform from a kind noble hunter to a wild madman filled with envy and obsession. The comic version keeps it more simple as Kraven takes a potion he stole from an African witch doctor that grants him incredible strength and stamina. The last similarity is actually a funny one that I'm glad the showrunners adopted. So both stories present two ladies who Peter is infatuated with. That is Mary Jane Watson and Felicia Hardy in the episode, and Liz Allen and Betty Brant in the comic. The episode didn't have MJ or Felicia interacting with each other, but as I shared earlier, Peter had to ditch both ladies when Kraven arrived at the fashion show they were attending. He couldn't fulfill his promise to be with either lady afterwards, and by the end of the episode, Peter was completely frustrated that he helped out one couple solve their issues at the cost of him missing out on two incredible romantic opportunities.
What a beautiful happy ending. I feel like I'm trapped in a Danielle Steele novel. Correct me if I'm wrong, but isn't the hero supposed to get the girl? I saved the city from Jungle Boy, and I'll be lucky if Mary Jane or Felicia ever speak to me again.
The comic is more melodramatic and soap opera-ish, so I'll need to actually explain what happened in full. Ready?
When Kraven arrived in New York, Peter was there in attendance to see him for his job at the Daily Bugle. Peter's high school friends also arrived to see Kraven, which includes Liz Allen and Flash Thompson. Betty Brant, also in attendance, gets unreasonably jealous with how friendly and close Peter is to the young Liz. Betty then becomes mad at Peter for the rest of the issue, much to his confusion and annoyance. After his first fight with Kraven, Peter makes a promise to Aunt May that he will go out with his neighbor's niece, but Peter is not excited by this at all. Cut towards the end of the story, Peter defeated Kraven, and the following day at the Daily Bugle, Betty has a change of heart, apologizes for her behavior, and attempts to go out with Peter. However, due to the promise he made to his aunt, he rejects poor Betty, making Peter feel like a jerk for turning her down after she made the effort to be apologetic. As he returns home, Aunt May informs Peter that the niece could not make it to the date due to a headache. Relieved that Peter doesn't have to fulfill his promise, he immediately calls Betty to get another chance to go out with her, and Betty outright rejects him. Peter then calls Liz Allen to ask her out, but she's already out and about dancing with Flash Thompson, and the comic ends with Peter in costume, hanging out at the docks, alone and frustrated.
Obviously, this is much different from the episode, but the results are the same. Both stories end with Parker dealing with his trademark Parker luck. Kraven the Hunter is an ambitious yet flawed Villain of the Week episode. The story is filled with delightful melodrama between Kraven and Mariah and also provides exciting superheroic action. There are no rushed character arcs for the Dr. Octopus episode or any technical errors in the animation, and while it was a missed opportunity to adapt the original comic, the original ideas in the adaptation does a good job in giving Sergei an actual character with his own motives, drives, and fears rather than just being a prideful hunter. It has a messy second half that definitely needed to be rewritten. As it stands, by all objective measures, this is the most poorly written episode of Season 1 I have covered, but its entertainment factor softens its plot issues. Remember, better to be a poorly written story that's fun to watch than a well-written story that's boring. Here's hoping that future episodes do not go lower than this. Thank you for watching, and thank you to our longtime viewers for being patient for a new entry in this retrospective. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, share your positive or negative comments, any feedback is welcome, hype this video if you're on mobile, and if you're a new viewer, check out the previous episodes of Spider-Blood, which are all in this playlist. And subscribe to the Hackjack Show to stay up to date on future Spider-Blood videos and our live show. This is Hack, signing off.